Thank you. All right. Like I said, I'm John Wagoner. I'm the district conservationist for NRCS in Sheridan. I cover all of Madison County for work, but the office is there. So I know today's topic was or is pollinators. I'm going to tie this more to land management, good stewardship of the land, soil health, things like that, and how it applies to pollinators. Because to be honest, I really don't know that much about bugs and pollinators and things like that. So I'm going to leave all the trivia facts and really deep dive into that sort of stuff to Alyssa. So this is already not going to go well. So about us, NRCS, we're an agency under the USDA. We mainly work on private lands with ranchers, farmers, forest landowners to implement conservation projects all across the country. We have an office in pretty much every county in the entire US. Our local places are Bozeman, Dillon, Sheridan, Whitehall to serve those respective counties. Did anybody come from further than Gallatin, Madison, Beaverhead, Jefferson County? No? Okay. Yeah, came from Helena. Some of our history within NRCS. We started back in the Dust Bowl. There was a lot of poor practices that were happening back in the 30s, tilling up or disking under, grassland in Oklahoma, the Great Plains and whatnot. And followed by some pretty severe drought, ended up with dust storms large enough that they were blowing clear across the country, 200-300 miles out into the Atlantic Ocean. And at that point, politicians thought, hey, this is pretty bad. We need to do something about it. So that's what started the soil conservation movement. NRCS got started. We were the Soil Conservation Service then, and the conservation districts in each county kind of started to be formed then. Right now we have Jefferson Conservation District, Ruby Valley, and Madison Conservation Districts in our county. They all have meetings every month. I'd encourage everyone to go check it out, see what's going on. And what we've been working on since then. We've done a lot of, row crop stuff like contour farming, setting up terraces to reduce soil erosion. We've done a lot of irrigation, efficiency stuff, stream restorations. That was right outside of Alder on the Ruby. We've done all kinds of grazing stuff. So we've came a long way. We've done a lot in the past 90 years. However, we have a lot of stuff to still overcome. We still have massive soil erosion problems happening. Pretty much all the cropland in the world is eroding soil faster than we're building it. Our food is less nutrient dense than it was 50 years ago because of our poor soil health on most of our cropland in the US. We have less and less rain every year and less precipitation, which is a tighter restriction on our water use for recreation, irrigation, etc. And we still have things that kind of look like the Dust Bowl. That's me at work 3 years ago. I think one thing to note is how much lighter the soil is in that dust and how much less carbon and organic matter there is versus 90 years ago. So I think the first step to understanding some of our problems is it's just not dirt. It's not something to just pump fertilizer into to grow a crop. In a teaspoon of soil, you have 100 million to 1 billion microbes, bacteria, fungi, etc. It's a living system underground, and it's kind of like a food web here. And a lot of the stuff conventional farming does tears up that system, right? If you're disking up your soil, spraying it with pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, eventually all those little things that make the system work are gone. So some of our soil health principles to kind of restore that whole thing, that whole food web. Soil armor, minimizing our soil disturbance if we're not, exposing the bacteria that's beneficial to our plants to oxygen and sunlight and killing them, airing out the soil so fungi can't grow, things like that. Maximizing our diversity of our plants, therefore maximizing our diversity of fungi, bacteria, protozoa in the soil, and then living roots in the soil. Again, we're just going to go through each of these. So for soil armor, I think this is a pretty extreme case, probably somewhere in the Midwest. I don't know if we could get to that point in Montana, but this guy's got a roller crimper on the front of his tractor, probably like a cereal rye or annual rye for a cover crop. It looks like he's drilling right through that stubble, using that as basically a mulch over his crop. And what soil armor does, cools your surface, soil surface. Here in Montana, I've stuck a thermometer out on bare soil, like on the East Bench, and it's like 120 degrees and it's probably like 90 degrees, air temp. So your bacteria growth and soil life start to die out, around 100 degrees. So that's too hot for soil health. And then your soil armor also holds in moisture just like mulch does or anything like that. Prevents wind and water erosion as long as you have it covered. And then I think one overlooked benefit, you have those plants pulling nutrients up from deep in the soil where they haven't been accessed before and they're decaying on the top. So your actual crop can receive those nutrients. For minimizing soil disturbance, I see a lot of guys here, they do a lot of disking, a lot of tilling, setting up their seed bed. When I think the technology's there, and we have the ability to plant right into existing stubble like this guy is, I think the typical mindset or image that a lot of farmers see is like this clean black dirt field. They don't think you can plant into stuff like this. Some of the benefits of not disking, not tilling, plowing your fields, maintain your soil structure. I think the big one here, I don't think we get enough rain to not absorb every inch of it. By compressing that soil with a disc and breaking up your airspace, if you're having puddles in your field, you're not getting the whole 8 inches of rain we get every year. No, I think that's probably the biggest thing is we don't have enough rain to lose any. Also, again, maintaining that bacteria and fungi and whatnot in the soil. And the one for me that kills me when I see people out there is like, are you not already busy enough? Have you not seen diesel prices? Do we need to be recreational disking 10 different directions? I think $5 is plenty. So this guy, his name's Corey Falk. He's up in Sunburst. He has a pretty big wheat, pulse crop, grazing operation. And he's doing all kinds of crazy stuff, or not that crazy, just doing typical soil health principles. He has a stripper header on this wheat, so it's just pulling the wheat off the top and leaving quite a bit of residue. He's got cover crops and whatnot, so hopefully this video works and we can kind of see what he's got going on. Maybe it'll work. Okay, maybe not. Anyway, he's doing cover crops, so he has in his fields, he'll have a thick layer of residue, like you can't even see bare soil. Yeah, and he's leaving as much residue as possible. This guy actually has gotten so much moisture and organic matter that he has like mushrooms and fungi and whatnot growing in his fields. So that was like his metric of success.
It's just a picture. Sorry. I'm trying to figure it out. Okay.
Oh, well.
Oh, no. There we go.
And he also talks about in this video, having that stubble and having that plant residue and matter above the ground enables him to catch a lot of snow in the winter time, which is like extra irrigation that all of his neighbors don't get because the snow just blows to Great Falls or wherever it ends up. So maximize your diversity. Like I said, you know, if you have that soil network, that food web, you're attracting lots of beneficial bacteria, fungi. I like this picture with the mushroom because fungus can attach to your plant's roots and they grow their hyphae, which is like a root for a mushroom or a fungus. And that system is probably 2-3 times larger than your plant's root system, so they can pull nutrients and moisture from much further than your plant can reach and bring it to the plant. So if it's super hot, super dry, and we're disking it and killing that stuff, your plants aren't getting everything that they could if you were doing things a little bit different. So I think if you're planting a diverse stand or cover crop or yard, however you want to apply it on your context, you're attracting, you know, diverse fungi and bacteria that all have a beneficial thing to something, which I think leads to, you know, lots of wildlife diversity. Yeah, go ahead.
Does that mean fairy rings in the yard are a good thing?
I don't know what a fairy ring is.
It's a ring of mushrooms.
I would think so. Yeah. So if you're, you know, if you have diverse plants, you're probably going to have a diverse habitat for bees, deer, butterflies, hummingbirds. And I think you also probably have more nutrient dense plants for your livestock if you're a rancher or a farmer. It's all connected in some way, I guess is my main ticket. Having a living root as long as possible. I think plants like this deep rooted, I think that's probably like a cover crop of some sort. That guy's up out of Stanford. You know, you can use those roots to break up compaction layers. If he has pores that big for a root like that, he's probably absorbing all the rain they get in Stanford, all the snow melt, all the irrigation. He's getting every bit of water that he can, not letting it run off. A trivia fact that I think is pretty important. If you have plants, you're pulling in carbon out of the atmosphere and turning it into organic matter. If you increase your soil organic matter by 1%, you're going to increase your water holding capacity by about 20,000 gallons to the acre, and 1 inch of irrigation on an acre is about 27,000 gallons of water. So I think that's pretty huge. Granted, a 1% increase in organic matter around here would be pretty tough to pull off, but if you had 0.5%, quarter, something like that, you know, little steps get there. Increase. Go ahead.
When you talk 1% and with our soil structure here, how deep are you talking for that 1% addition in the soil makeup?
I don't know what 1% would be. I don't, you know, like 5 tons of soil is about the thickness of a dime. So I guess depending on where you start out, if you build the thickness of a dime, you're probably getting close. Yeah, so the Dust Bowl, there's about, like, I think it said 1.2 billion tons of soil lost across 100 million acres. If you do the math on that, that's about 2 thicknesses of a dime across that acre. So it's not like we're losing feet and feet and feet of topsoil. So it doesn't take much to lose everything you had. I'm sure that's not going to work, so. Maybe. That video there, same guy. He just has a video. It had rained like 2 inches on top of about 6 inches of snow. And the road was like a sloppy mess, puddles everywhere. He walks out into his field. I think he actually drove out into his field and didn't pick up any mud, and digs a hole, and the soil's just like nice and filled with air and lots of pockets, and there's worms in his shovel. A scoop of dirt. So just another success story of like implementing this stuff. He's absorbing all the water and moisture that he gets. So anyway, you guys are probably like, we're here to talk about pollinators. Who's this guy? What is he talking about? So I'm going to bring it all around. I hope it makes sense and it applies. All this stuff applies in a context that's beneficial to pollinators. You know, I'm not an entomologist like Alyssa is. But when I see stuff like this all the time, I have a tough time thinking that there isn't a problem and pollinators aren't on the decline, and there's got to be a reason for it. And I do think agriculture on a large scale is probably part of the problem, but I do think that agriculture is probably geared up and probably one of the biggest able bodies to help improve things, because they are good at growing plants and the things that pollinators do need. So if we just tweak what we're doing a little bit, I think people I work with in agriculture do stand a pretty good chance to turn things around for everybody. So what could you do? We'll see a lot of alfalfa around here, which is good. That provides a flowering plant for pollinators. But I also see a lot of reset years after an alfalfa stand's worn out, and they just do triticale. It's like, can we do better than that? I think so. Could you do 5, 6, 10 species of a cover crop, provide flowering plants throughout the summer, increase your diversity for a year, shift your microbes around, get something more beneficial than just another cool season plant after 7 years of cool season plants. I see a lot of weedy pivot corners with nothing on them. I think if we implemented a lot of these practices on our pivot corners and we had little hubs of pollinator habitat or habitat for deer, elk, what have you, whatever you're into, I think we have a lot better opportunity than spotted knapweeds and bare dirt. Pauline and I, my wife back there, we planted a pollinator garden in our front yard. It was just like a weedy mess, bare dirt. It looked like crap. So we got some seeds from Conservation District. Yeah, they have them right over here. So, you know, it's only ended up being like, I don't know, 30 by 30, but got rid of a weedy patch. It was pretty cool watching all the little bees. So I think all that stuff can apply at whatever scale or context you need it to be. I think there's lots of edges of pivots, lots of people's yards on their 5 acres that they just bought that's overgrazed rangeland because they wanted to have 50 horses out there when they moved to Montana. And I think the aesthetics is pretty cool. Food for wildlife, like who doesn't like having moose in their backyard? I know I like seeing them. And luckily for everyone here, DNRC delivers trees out of their nursery right to our office in Sheridan. They're super cheap. Come get some. And then grazing. I think you have the ability to alter your grazing to promote diversity by just maybe changing up your disturbance times. If you're hitting the same plant at the same time every year, eventually you're going to lose that plant, versus just shaking up your rotation, giving everything an opportunity to do its entire life cycle. So I think whatever your context is, everybody has a little room to do something different. So you're probably like, well, I don't know what to plant, or I don't know what kind of trees. Anybody that wants to, they can hop on the NRCS website, go to our field office technical guide, and there's tech notes in there. That's what this is. So this is like all of our native and introduced plants that are pollinator friendly. When we're doing a pollinator friendly mix, these 3 columns here, it's early, middle, and late bloom periods. So everything we do that's pollinator specific, we have multiple species in each bloom period, so we're providing foraging habitat for as long as possible throughout the year. The ones on the left that I've highlighted are ones we've used in Madison County and had pretty good luck with, like blanket flower, some flax, lupin, prairie coneflower, purple coneflower. We've had pretty good success with those. And so then this one here is like a job sheet. So anybody that works for an NRCS, I can make a seed mix, tell you how many pounds to the acre, what species and whatnot. I can give that to you. You can go to a seed dealer and buy a mix or get something close to it. So the resources are there if you're like, hey, I want to do this, but I don't know what to do. So I'd encourage all of you to go tinker in there. You might find something interesting. Application on all scales, I kind of touched on it. That picture on the top left's on the edge of a pivot above Twin Bridges on the bench. I'd say that's on the larger end of things we've done, probably a couple 100 yards long by 60 feet wide. Like he's got like 4 or 5 rows of shrubs in there, just using his end gun to hit it and irrigate it. He wasn't using it for grazing or hanging it or anything like that. So he was like, hey, I'm going to do something productive here. He's got beehives anyway, so win-win for him. Same thing, bottom left. I think Pheasants Forever had a program called Corners for Wildlife. They're just doing like a pollinator wildflower mix on the edge of pivots. The one thing I think is important to consider when you're doing stuff up next to agriculture like that is make sure it's wide enough that your pesticide isn't drifting and killing everything in it, or try to avoid using pesticides against it. And then on a smaller scale, like Holly and I did, just in our yard, I knew that when we were going to do it, our biggest thing was going to be forage kochia, because Twin Bridges is like a forage kochia factory. It's awesome. And so we definitely went with the weed fabric covering everything. And then we put mulch on top of it because we didn't want to look at weed fabric all summer long. And then we were thinking, how do we get water to it, but only to the stuff we want to have water? So we use this soaker hose, just like 1/4-inch stuff, put a zip tie around the end of it. Because we were like, if we go with the emitters, then it's all going to be super spotty. And so we did that. We mixed the seed up in like a bag of potting soil, just because our yard was looking pretty rough. Some pretty serious wind erosion out there. And then like in that picture, you know, they're just doing trees. But I do think if you're doing it like in your yard, or if you just bought 5 acres from somebody that's had 50 horses out there forever, weeds are going to be your biggest thing. And I think limiting water to the plants that you do want and not watering everything. Otherwise, you're just going to be irrigating the knapweed and stuff growing there already. And then, yeah, I think the weeds, handling the weeds is the biggest thing.
Do you have any tips on a really good crop of kochia? How to get it to stop living?
We found that if you don't have any soil, that kind of helps. Why did that?
Build soil.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of where we were at. We were like, man, it's pretty bad. We buried some rocks where we ripped out some shrubs, and then the tops of the rocks started showing up from the hole. So that's when we decided we were going to do something on our little 0.2 acre ranch in Twin Bridges. So resources available to you: RVCD, Root Valley Conservation District, and the Madison District. They have equipment rentals. I hope that's right. They got tree planters, fabric rollers, a couple different seeders, some stuff like that. So if you're wanting to do a pretty large scale, you can rent that for next to nothing, I guess. And get it done. They both have their pollinator initiative, so there's little seed packets like that. If you're just wanting to do it in your yard or a flower bed, or I guess they maybe let you take a bunch of seeds if you wanted to do acres.
Feeling bold. Sorry, I'm gonna interject here. As part of our pollinator initiative, we recently received huge rolls of plastic sheeting. It's a great way to get rid of weeds if you put it down for a couple of years and let it just burn off everything. Both CDs I have 4 rolls, you have 3 rolls of that. Additionally, I do have drip line that can be available for anyone interested on the Ruby side. So just food for thought. Feel free to come in and have a conversation with me and we can get going on a plot at some point.
Yeah, and if any of you guys want to take some plastic with you tonight, we can cut you some. Like John was saying, that solarization really helps if you do like a year of plastic to kill that any weeds that are there, and it'll also like heat the soil up enough to make the seed bank no longer viable. So it can drastically reduce the weeds. And we also, to go along with the Pollinator Initiative, part of our equipment rental program is we just got a honey extractor. So if anybody has bees,
Sweet. So you guys got the seed, the weed fabric. All you need is a little spot in your yard and you're good to go.
Does the plastic like kill all of the microbes and fungi and stuff in there too, or is it?
Probably to some level.
it's a great question.
Yeah.
Probably. I would guess so. So we have NRCS programs. We have, like I said, I can just write you a job sheet. You can go to a seed dealer and buy whatever you want. We also have a new program. It's called community agriculture. So if you want to incorporate this next to your garden or your 5-acre, pasture where you're grazing to sell, a couple beef a year. That one I have circled in red is just like a small pollinator plot, like less than 1,000 square feet. I can't remember what the cost share is, but basically you could enter a contract with NRCS, say, hey, I'm gonna do X, Y, and Z, including doing this pollinator project on, 1,000 square feet or whatever, or 500 square feet, whatever you want to do, and get reimbursed for it. So. That's pretty much all I have. I think I'll leave you with that quote from the Wolf of Wall Street. Without action, it's just an intention. So it's up to you. Any questions? Yes, Linda.
So you're talking about trying not to till the ground.
Yeah.
Okay, let's put that into a garden perspective. Is it better to, say you have an old garden spot, you just try to do a cover crop and manage it and then put your plants, your vegetables in there? Or is it different when you're doing a garden?
I'm not much of a gardener, so I don't know if I'm the best to answer that. I'm sure there's somebody that's doing no-till. In the past, I've tried to not till my gardens. I haven't really done cover crops within the garden, but I've tried to kill the existing grass with other methods. We try to stay away from chemicals and whatnot at our place, but
So my cover crop is usually weeds.
yeah.
I coordinate the Jeffers Community Garden.
Perfect.
So
You're the person to talk to.
so we do everything out there. Jim Kramer is a really good contact person. A lot of the plots out there are now doing lasagna gardening. So we're not disturbing the soil, building on top of it. And we have brown, green, brown, green.
Gotcha.
You let it break down during the fall, through the winter. And then hopefully it's good enough to start planting in, and then you keep building.
But you're not tilling that up, you're just.
He's not. Kate Borgerty is not. So she has a spot where they rototill. I still rototill because I'm doing the food bank and the plot's huge. And for me to do a lasagna garden by myself, right now, unless I have more help, it's a little bit hard for me to do that. And I've done it for 7 years for the food bank. And that's rotating the crops,
Mhm.
you know, each plot that I have out. So our worst thing is the quack grass. And we've covered plots like you're talking about, and we just let them sit for a while. But that quack grass, it's right back, it comes right back. And it will just starve all new seedlings. If you leave one little rhizome in there, it's just enough for it to. So rototilling the quack grass is not a good idea. You need to get in there
Pull it.
Pull it. or do what you say, you know, at least let it sit for a couple of years. You're still gonna have it, but it's not gonna be as bad. But the quack grass is a real problem there. We have put, when Raya was working, we went ahead and we have like 2 research studies out there with the pollinator. So a couple of us have put maybe 6 by 12 plots covered with the pollinator. And that has really helped with the bees. So that's been real beneficial. But I would come by the community garden.
I look when I'm driving by, but I.
Yeah, well, right now we're under snow.
In the summer, I might have to weed.
So, but you might want to come out. But we're trying to go no-till.
Yeah,
Till out there. But it takes people to do it.
for sure.
Most average plots are 12 by 12 feet.
Are you aware of any grasses with long roots that, or plants with long roots that could go into yards that would help build soil like you're suggesting?
Yeah, you have a lot of options. One that we did, because it was so compacted from parking trucks on it and stuff. We just planted carrots in with our pollinator mix and they grew down, 6-8 inches, broke up the soil. We didn't dig most of them out. We would try and they would just snap off. So it was like, well, there's a, broom handle sized hole in the ground and that's good enough. A lot of people do like a tillage radish cover crop or a turnip, same thing. They'll just leave it and it'll break the soil and then just decompose right there. So maybe you could do that in your yard. A lot of the native grasses root really deep. So could just go like the native grass route too.
Such as an example.
Idaho fescue, blue bunch, something like that. I mean, a lot of that stuff, whatever's above the ground, if it's in good condition, your root system's probably 2-3 times the size of the above ground plant. So, but I don't know if that's like applicable in your context or if, some radishes, turnips in a garden would be better.
So are you telling us that if we take one of these small packets home, move our vehicles out of where we've been parking it, that we would have success? Or what are we gonna have to do to change that from a bare, hard packed surface?
Well, I don't know if it will be a success. I'm not promising you that. I know that's what we did in our yard and it did work.
We didn't till it or anything. We didn't even dig up the dirt, anything like that, and we didn't mix soil in with the seeds as well as carrot seeds, and we just made little mounds. And literally right on top, of course, some blew away. That's the nature of living here, but we had really good success. And our dirt was not even, it was compact, it was blowing away, it was nothing. as well as the lasagna gardens. We literally just went to our local dump and bought 2x4 planks, nailed them together into a plot, but then I have this much above ground and was able to do some hay, leaves, sticks, and then mix it in with some dirt and let that decompose. And then I added strawberries to it. And if you dig down, you know, the dirt that was there, that was really compact, you could tell the difference. And I think
Yeah, we didn't know the pollinator thing was gonna work at all,
Yeah.
because it was like
Our
concrete.
dirt was terrible. It was.
And we just
years
mixed,
This,
One year,
we just did it last year.
last year, and it worked. I mean, just adding that little layer, like I said, some blew away, but what stuck? There was actually a root system there. It was able to get into the ground just from adding that little bit of help to it.
Native plants are like very well adapted to
Yeah.
the area, obviously, and I think it's like kind of surprises people how well they can take hold in an area,
For sure.
especially certain species.
This is what they live for.
Yeah, right. That's it for them.
So that's what we did. I'm not gonna say it's gonna work in every situation, but worked for us. We've done enough. Like when NRCS had the honeybee pollinator initiative. I was always trying to get people to do a cover crop the year before with turnips and tillage radishes in it to try and break up that just like super hard compact soil. And I was always trying to get them to do like a triticale or cereal rye just so they could let that fall down and get packed down by the snow in the winter time and just have something to plant into. So they're not just planting into like scorching hot, East Bench or VC Hill dirt and just getting cooked by the sun. So,
We've done buckwheat. We've
Yeah.
done, peas
yeah,
out there. Cases of he suggested red clover.
I can see that.
For trying to get the weeds under
Yeah.
control, of the buckwheat and snap peas.
Yeah.
And then when it's all, when we pick the snap peas for the food bank, we just leave the vines on the ground. So.
So we did ours. We just left everything and a lot of it broke down over the winter. Some stuff we covered up with hay. Like you said, we were able to get that for free at the dump or through friends. Covered it. A lot of it broke down, which is great.
We don't use hay, we use straw. Because
Oh, yes,
the
straw.
weeds and I don't know, I'm sorry, I don't mean to, oh, is it straw? Okay, yeah, for the.
Yeah. Is that it? No more
That's
questions.
good. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. All right, sweet. Now for the real pollinators.
Those are sweet. There's a lot of good stuff in there.
Hit or miss.
Yeah, Dawn did a great job of kind of setting it up a little bit and did a really good job, I think, too, of like discussing things on scale. Like, anything that you do for pollinators will, I think, help, whether it be something super small in your yard or maybe you have a large plot of land or whatever, but anything you can do helps. So I guess I'll introduce myself a little bit too. My name's Alyssa Piccolomini. I work for the Montana Department of Agriculture as a state entomologist. And even though I have this, I feel like I have a really like grandiose inflated title, but really most of the work that I do revolves around the managed insects of Montana. And there's really only two. which I'll talk about later, but it's the alfalfa leaf cutting bee and the honeybee. So a lot of work that I do kind of revolves around those two species from a regulatory perspective, making sure that they're the stuff that or looking at individual populations and like community populations of those two species to make sure that they're healthy in Montana for agricultural purposes. So we'll kind of discuss that later on. Oh boy. Okay. Okay, so a lot of you, and John kind of alluded to this too, have probably heard in the news, like there's all these doom and gloom articles about insects are in decline. It's because of humans, from monoculture, agriculture, whatever. Insects are vanishing at an alarming rate. And there's a lot of things that we need to do to kind of make sure that this doesn't continue. And this is true too, like not just for all sorts of insects, but for honeybee colonies as well. This is a study by the Bee Informed Partnership, which does surveys every year on a national scale in the US and looks at what's contributing to colony losses, both at the like sideliner, commercial, and hobbyist scale. And it looks at those things both for the summer, winter, and annual. And you can see that kind of as the years have gone on, we've been experiencing more and more colony losses, and this is an average slide. I just really can't get this right. And it's true for individual scales too, backyard, sideliner, commercial. Backyard is, like someone who's keeping like 1 or 2 colonies as a hobby, maybe in like their garden or community garden. Sideliner could be someone who keeps like 10 to 50, 100 maybe, and then commercial beekeepers are those folks that are doing this like super large scale. They're running somewhere between usually like 2,000 and 20,000 colonies. And we have quite a few of those beekeepers here in Montana. Montana itself is a pretty heavy commercial beekeeper state. We have about 95 what we would call commercial beekeepers here, and they run about 300,000 colonies. And then we have around 600, 700 registered hobbyists that, run like 1,000 maybe combined. So something to definitely be concerned about. Like I said, these are the 2 managed pollinators that we have in Montana. Even Montana really is like kind of lucky. Most states do have honeybee related laws, but not a lot of them have other pollinator laws, especially out west. Maybe in the Midwest, it's picking up a little bit just because there's species of concern like the rusty patched bumblebee, the monarch butterfly, that kind of stuff. But these are 2 species of bees. They're both introduced to the US. They're not native at all. They were both introduced for agricultural reasons. Honeybees obviously introduced for a variety of different pollination services. And then alfalfa leaf cutting bees they do exactly what they say they do. They pollinate alfalfa for seed production. So if you're more interested in that, you can check out our website, agr.mt.gov/bee program, and I have packets up there. That's the same shameless plug. But there are a lot of factors that impact bees, and not just honeybees, not just leaf cutting bees, but all different types of bee species out there. The way that these things are managed, there's a ton of different pests, diseases, pathogens that impact all sorts of insects, just like us. Viruses affect them, bacteria affects them. Nutrition is a big player, kind of going to what John was talking about, like monoculture type stuff. Obviously, like it would be sweet to eat a cheeseburger every single day, but I'm probably not going to be in very good health if I were to do so. So keeping a diverse diet's a good idea. Environment's a really big factor, making sure they have food, water, shelter, that kind of stuff. And then pesticide exposure is a really big deal too. So we'll kind of dive into some of that stuff a little bit. Like I said, we have the alfalfa leaf cutting bee and the honeybee here in Montana, but in the United States, there's over 4,000 native bee species.
So I've read that there's 1,000 native bee species in Montana. Is that accurate?
So I kind of get into this a little bit later on, but that's a good question. So when all of that kind of insect decline stuff was coming out in the news, a lot of us were getting asked questions like, what does that look like in Montana? And a couple of our entomology people were pretty tight-knit crew. We were like, I don't know, because no one's actually ever done any sort of studies in Montana. So there's a group at MSU right now, Dr. Casey Delphia and Dr. Mike Ivy. They're doing some pretty awesome work where they're just going around the state and surveying. It's a 15-year project. They're in year 5 right now. You guys might have heard about it. But they're basically surveying, and I think they're at like 750 native bee species right now, but they haven't gone through all the samples that they've collected. They're not done sampling, and it's estimated like there's some counties that are like missing data entirely, especially out east. So it's likely that 1,000 is a pretty good estimate, which is crazy because, you know, like most other states have, you know, maybe a couple hundred. So it's really impressive. And bees themselves, you know, they're the role of bees in our environment too is they're out there seeking pollen nectar, not only to pollinate different crops for fruit production, and to provide for their offspring, but also to increase biodiversity through those mechanisms. So really important in the ecosystem. In terms of what you're going to see out here, there's really like 5 different types of bees that I think that you're likely to see. Honeybee, obviously one of them. Like I think most people when they're like, yeah, what's going on with the bees? And I'm like, what kind of bee? Like you're talking about the little tiny perdita bee or honeybee. But I think most people when they say that, they mean honeybees. Maybe bumblebees are like number 2 in what people think of when they think of bees. Things like the mason bee, blue orchid bee, really closely related to the alfalfa leaf cutting bee, the little green sweat bees, and some small carpenter bees like that. And as you can even kind of see, like I don't have their exact measurements up here. I didn't want to shame anybody like bumblebee and its large size or anything like that, but they're all really different in size, shape, the number of hairs on their body, that kind of stuff. So because of that, they have all these different nesting requirements, floral preferences, that kind of thing. And that plays a really big role in how we think about managing our land. And, you know, I'm talking a lot about bees because that's my area. That's what I mostly work on, but there's all sorts of different type of invertebrate pollinators. Obviously, we're all familiar with vertebrate pollinators too, things like birds, bats, that kind of stuff. But there's a whole slurry of insect orders that are responsible for pollination services. Bees obviously being like top of the chain just because they're really easy to manage in certain instances and are great for certain crops. But butterflies and moths, flies, does anyone like chocolate? Of course. You can thank a fly for that. A little tiny midge is what pollinates the cacao plants. Same goes for coffee. And then beetles are one of the largest insect orders out there, and they pollinate a lot just because of their sheer number too. So pretty cool to think about. And that's all really important, like when we think of what we're planting in our garden too, right? So one of the big things is like all of those insects are super different from each other. And so are flowers. Some insects are very well adapted and they're to a certain plant and they're only going to pollinate a certain looking plant, like for example, the alfalfa leaf cutting bee. The honeybee is really terrible at pollinating alfalfa because it doesn't like the keel. It doesn't like when it goes into the flower, it kind of gets like knocked around and it's like, this is annoying. I'll just go around to the side, drill a hole and suck the nectar out and fly away. And it's not actually collecting any of the pollen and transferring that at all. So something like the leaf cutting bee that's a little bit smaller doesn't really mind going in there because it's not getting knocked around as much and it doesn't mind that. So things like, you know, and that's something to consider when you're thinking about what to do with your garden. Like, do you want to attract generalist species? Do you want to attract more like niche species? And just keep that in mind when you're planting. This is like a super old version of the NRCS document John was talking about, but it's the same thing. Like, you know, it has a list of different plants that are native, shrubs, you know, forbs, whatever, and you can't really see it because of all the fun little tidbits we have up top, but it has it broken down by month and it tells you when the peak bloom is for that kind of stuff. So referencing documents like this are going to be really important too. Another kind of like hot topic, And something to keep in mind is, like native versus cultivars. Everyone knows what a cultivar is, right? Okay, sometimes people don't. But obviously native plants they're well established here, they're adapted to this area. And then cultivar is something that like maybe looks like a native, but has been modified in some way. Like maybe it has more ornate petals, like a larger number of petals, maybe instead of a, yellow rudbeckia, it's white or pink or something. And all of those things are great. And I think it's an awesome idea to incorporate cultivars and natives into your garden. Because sometimes natives will, maybe they bloom for longer. Maybe they do have a weird offset thing where they have more pollen or something like that. But they're not going to be the end all be all. Usually a lot of them do lack nectar or pollen, or they like look funny. Bees don't see red like we do, so they most see in UV, and what we perceive as a bright, fun-looking flower might not look that way to a bee. So it's a good idea to keep natives. Just that's because what our native insects have evolved with. But yeah, not a bad idea to keep cultivars. Just don't do all cultivars is my main message from that. A big thing too is just plant fewer larger blocks of flowers. There's most of the solitary bees, native bees that we have in the world really they're super tiny and they're just not gonna fly and forage as far as like something like a honeybee will. If a honeybee is really desperate, it could fly up to 7 miles to collect nectar or floral resource. And some of our smaller bees just don't do that because of their life cycle. So just keeping plants close together. I usually tell folks that like a rule of 3 is a good thing. Like if you're going to buy plants, like buy 3 of them and kind of clump them together and kind of work off that. Don't just buy one, like put it over here and then buy another one, put it over here and see what happens. But keeping things together is a great idea to help provide resources for pollinators. And not only, I love this photo, not only for foraging, but it's really important too. So like these are 2 male cellophane bees that are sleeping in a flower. So it's really important it's not just for food, but also for shelter sometimes. And I mean, who wouldn't want to look at that every day? Maybe I'm biased, but. So like here's a good example of something that I pulled from Oregon State University, but it's a really good kind of blanket and what you should look for when planting a garden. Obviously this is on like a smaller scale, but you can see that you have different trees, shrubs, things that that kind of stuff kind of blooms in the spring, and everything's kind of clumped together. There are maybe some, non-native plants mixed in there, which again, I think that's totally fine. But the biggest thing too is that you're starting to see like there's this kind of stuff, and then there's also some bare ground that's in there, some habitat for native pollinators, and that's really important. I don't know if I can go back, but so we have those 5 bee species that I was talking about at the beginning, right? And like the honeybee, everyone knows that that's a social organism that is in a high body. But things like our native pollinators, most of them live underground. So they're living in this like top left corner in they'll kind of like drill holes into the ground into something that looks like this. And it depends upon the species. Like sometimes it is just a singular tube with a singular egg in the ground. Sometimes there's a couple of eggs and larvae provisioning in there. Sometimes the females will dig these all like kind of crazy, fun, different structures underground. It's really dependent on species. But keeping just plain bare dirt for them. So maybe if you do get a seed pollinator mix from the office and you throw it down and nothing happens, maybe that's just where you keep your pollinator area, your nesting material. Yeah, so just keeping that in mind when you're planting your garden too. It's awesome to just cover an area with flowers and grasses and that kind of stuff, but providing a nesting material for them is really essential as well. And then this image on the left here is a bee house. Has anyone seen those before? Yeah, so I kind of have a little example of it here. You can buy these like pretty much anywhere online, or I mean, even I think I've gotten some from like Murdoch's or North 40 or something like that even. But basically it just mimics like a pithy stem from an old plant, and the female will come into this entrance hole. She'll it depends upon the species, like if it's a leaf cutting bee, she'll take these semicircle leaf pieces and line the inside of the tube to try to seal it up from different parasitoids and to keep out certain pathogens and pests. She'll collect pollen and nectar, make what we call bee bread, lay an egg, put a partition in, and then fill it up all the way until the end. And all of the above ground nesting species do this. So, the bee houses have become really popular with folks that maybe don't want to go into the whole thing of keeping honeybees, but they want to have some sort of structure for them. So it's a fun project. And obviously that's really different from something like the bumblebee. So the bumblebee is what we call semi-social, which basically means that it's not social like the honeybee, and it's not totally solitary like, leaf cutting bee, something like that. I know, really techie term right there. But basically what a bumblebee does is the queen will overwinter by herself. In the spring, she'll come out, usually it's probably a little early now, maybe like early April is when you'll start seeing them flying around, especially some of the larger species like Bombus nevadensis or something. But she'll go out, start foraging on whatever pollen and nectar she can find, we'll look for a nest structure, usually they're always underground too, for the most part, near logs, rocks, that kind of thing. We'll start provisioning, we'll lay a couple of eggs. Then her offspring will emerge. They'll go out, start collecting for the hive. And then queens will be reared again in the fall. They'll go out, mate, and then they'll go and disperse and overwinter by themselves too. So a little bit different than a leaf cutting bee or, solitary bee species, because they do have that sister, brother component, queen component to their colony. And really different from a honeybee colony that, it does have one queen, but can get up to 60,000 workers in the peak of summer. And then we'll kind of dwindle those numbers later on, but there's a ton of different workers in there that are help provisioning for the colony, whereas bumblebee colonies kind of stick near the 20 to 100 individual count. So some tips it's kind of a lot of information, but some tips for managing pollinators in your yard. They're, managing honeybees is a whole nother story, right? You got to get the bee suit, you have to apply miticides, you have to go in there pretty frequently. The solitary guys are pretty easy because it's you put these out, or maybe just leave a patch of bare dirt and you're okay, whatever, I don't really have to mess with this at all. But we are finding that it's a really good idea to, at least if you do keep something like this in your yard in a little house or whatever, it's a really good idea to bring them in the spring. And you can just kind of leave them like this. I have a bunch of them in my house that I'll just kind of take them like this and maybe put them in some brown paper bags, break them apart a little bit. I won't keep a clump like this or a whole house structure together, but keep them in some brown paper bags or in a cardboard box, put them in your refrigerator, and then you can put them back out in the spring and let them emerge. This really helps break down the number of parasitoids that we're seeing. So it's kind of like a human management effort to reduce some of the predators that they're seeing out here. And it's a kind of a big deal because in Washington, for the first time, everyone heard of the murder hornet thing, right? Yeah. Well, now there's a Houdini fly. But basically what it is, it's a little tiny fly parasitoid that enters in the back of the nest structure, and a parasitoid is something that kills its prey entirely. So the female fly will lay its eggs on the larvae of the developing bee, and then eat the larvae, or the eggs then hatch, the larvae feed on the bee, and then they like pupate and, you know, take over where the bee once was.
Do these affect honeybees?
The Houdini fly?
No, yeah, Houdini fly.
No, they're just parasitoids of solitary bees. Honeybees have a lot of their own ailments. But so this is a X-ray of, this is what I do in the winter is alfalfa leaf cutting bee growers in the state will send me the individual bees and then I X-ray them, which is crazy. And when I first started with the department, this is from a digital X-ray image, but I was just given a key to a dark room and they were like, okay, just, yeah, take the X-ray and then just hand develop the film. And I was like, I don't know, playing recess and looking at bugs when I was in high school or whatever. I wasn't taking photo class, so I have no idea what I'm doing. We've since gotten a more high-tech image and now we have this really nice digital X-ray, but it's pretty cool because like up there you can see the kind of zoomed in image of the cells and you can see like in this one right there, obviously it doesn't look like a nice healthy bee larvae. It looks like there's a bunch of little things in there. So there's a parasitoid wasp in that one. And then the one next to it is like a nice healthy looking bee. So we kind of like take these images. I actually do a lot for Washington because we do accept samples from out of state. But we X-ray those images and then let the growers know what they're seeing so that they, one, know what pests they have in their yard or in their operation, and to know how many live bees to stock per acre when they're pollinating alfalfa for seed production. So kind of cool. If anyone's ever like has these two and wants to send them to me in X-ray, if you're like curious, I can send them back to you. We do that all the time too. So for honeybees, there's a ton of different pests, like I just was saying, that affect these guys. We have a lot of regulated ones in the state that has like a pretty, that's really most of what I'm doing in the summer is going out and inspecting honeybee colonies to make sure that they don't have some of these regulated pests so that we can maintain healthy honeybee populations here in Montana. But there's a slurry of unregulated pests too. The biggest one is for sure the varroa mite. Has anyone heard of that? Or is anyone a beekeeper or know someone that's a beekeeper? Yeah, okay. So it's like essentially a dinner size, that's how it would translate to a human, would be a dinner size parasite sucking on your fat bodies and transmitting viruses to you at like super high levels. So obviously not very good for you. So we spend a lot of time in the Department of Agriculture helping folks get some tools to monitor for them and kind of steer them in the right direction for treating them as well.
Can you explain what's the difference between a regulated pest and a non-regulated? What does regulated and non-regulated mean?
So regulated, it's like we have laws in Montana, like you can go and look at the statute that pertains to them. And they're like listed in our laws and in our rules. So if we find them, there's like a bunch of different management tactics that we take. Whereas something that's unregulated, it's more of like a loose conversation, I would say, about how to manage it. Yeah.
Okay.
I think Montana sends about 200,000 hives to pollinate the almond crops
Yeah.
in California.
Yeah.
And they're joined by another million some hives from the Dakotas and all over. What is the concern on your level about transmitting diseases back and forth? And is there any regulations about inspections from state border to state border?
Yeah, there is. That's a really good question. So we do have really specific laws pertaining to that. Our commercial beekeepers are on like a pretty strict inspection schedule. Like I am the only person that does this in Montana, therefore the state is my entire territory, so it's quite difficult to check everybody like as they're coming through the border station. or, you know, across the state lines. But they're on a regular inspection schedule. Those beekeepers that are selling products to hobbyist beekeepers get inspected more frequently to ensure that they're not spreading diseased or distributing diseased colonies to a bunch of other different people. And then Montana itself, we're one of the few states left that has what we just call a 3-mile radius law, which basically, if you're a commercial beekeeper and I'm a commercial beekeeper, we can't put any of our locations within 3 miles of each other. And the thought behind that is that, like, while I said that honeybees could fly up to 7 miles for forage, like, we have pretty good forage availability here in Montana, so they're really not flying more than like a mile in the summer to collect those things. So it kind of creates like a pseudo buffer to help reduce the spread of those pests and diseases. Does that answer your question? Yeah, so I should have just clicked to these slides. And really the message here is that if you are managing bees, whether it be solitary or honeybees, just be a good neighbor. Be a good neighbor. Yeah.
Question.
Yeah.
Growing up, all of the bee hives, the supers, they were white.
Mm-hmm.
And now they're coming with all these different colors.
Yeah.
Does that color coding mean anything, or is it just random?
Sometimes it does. I've asked beekeepers the same thing, and some of them will just say that it's like they'll just go to the hardware store and they're like, do you have any mismade paints or something? And they'll get them at a discounted rate because whoever mixed them didn't do it right. So they'll paint their hive bodies with that. Some of them do, like, there's a guy in Townsend that really likes painting his boxes white, and then he paints all of his supers like bright green for whatever reason, so that he can like keep track of which boxes only have honey in them and which boxes have all of the brood in them, because it kind of changes the wax coloration. Most of them I think are just like, whatever, I don't care, give me whatever cheapest paint. I think white is probably one of the cheaper paints.
My dad used
Out
to
there.
say it was because white was a cooler color and helped.
Yeah,
the hive.
maybe. I haven't heard of any like research to back that up. I've heard the same thing. I don't know. I think it's kind of, it depends on who you ask.
Question on a couple slides back,
Mhm.
the Verona mite is not a regulated
No.
concern?
Mm-mm.
Why not?
It is everywhere. If you have bees, you have mites, so it's kind of a hard thing to regulate. There's some states out on the East Coast that do have some Varroa-ish laws where it's like, if you were to sell like a package of bees or a nucleus colony of bees, you can't have over a certain threshold.
But isn't the Verona mite probably the biggest cause of loss?
Yeah, for sure.
So why is it regulated?
Well, I think it's just so abundant everywhere. Like, you're not going to be able to, it's like you can't keep bees and leave your Varroa levels untreated. Maybe you can for a year, but you're definitely not going to be a commercial beekeeper at all, because you'll never be able to sustain your populations. I mean, we're seeing 40 to 50% losses as an average now since Varroa mites have been introduced, and I don't know a single commercial beekeeper that doesn't treat for them. It's actually quite the opposite. There's a bunch of them that use off-labeled products to try and control it because what's currently out there isn't doing a job well enough, or it's too expensive or whatever. So I agree with you that it like maybe should be, but I mean, it's like one of those things that you just kind of have to deal with anyways. Yeah.
Are any of those bees, the honeybees, the production ones that travel, are they wintered in Montana?
Some of them are. We do have a couple of sheds, like old potato silos, or like some of them have built sheds that they'll stay in for the winter until they go down and do almond pollination. But most of them go to California around like October, November, and they just stay down there, and maybe they'll do like some other kind of pollination service, and then they'll get in on almonds. And yeah, we have about 300,000 colonies, and 98% of them travel to California for all, specifically for almond pollination. And that's the largest pollination event in the world. There's like 1.5 million colonies in the United States make that journey specifically for almond pollination. So this is from a publication, maybe like a year or two ago, that kind of shows like the image on, I know the text is kind of small and hard to read, but the image on the left is kind of what the migration patterns used to look like for commercial colonies, and now on the right is what it is now. So it's like everyone is coming to California, basically is what this image is saying, and like a lot of people on the East Coast like go to Florida. So it's kind of, instead of becoming this like many small scale pollination event, it's really been dichotomized to like basically California and Florida.
So Canada doesn't bring bees back and forth to California?
No, there's I can't get into all of that, but there's a lot of contentious issues with Canada and like how the border for bee migration has been closed since like the 80s. And it gets argued about all the time about people that get paid a lot more than I do. Probably aren't entomologists though. So another big caution, and John hit on this too, is for sure just make sure that if you do have to use pesticides, to really think about when you're applying them. I know that it's kind of hard, but a big general rule of thumb that I usually give people is that it's a really good idea to try and not spray when stuff is in bloom, or at least not in peak bloom. Easier said than done. A lot of our solitary species here in Montana emerge really early in the spring, and then we have some that go really late into the fall. So that right there is our entire growing season. And of course, at some point in time, you're going to have to apply some sort of pesticide. But if you can't avoid spraying the flowers, doing so in the early morning or late at night is a really good idea. A lot of them get volatilized off in the sunlight, and that'll help reduce exposure. And usually bees are only flying and a lot of insects are only flying at the hottest times of the day. So if you can avoid spraying during those times, that'll really be beneficial and reduce some of the mortality that's associated with pesticide exposure. This is kind of a slide based on whoever asked the question about the Montana bee survey that is going on at MSU. They made this sweet document a couple of years ago where it basically just highlights the 5-ish, 6-ish major families of bees that you would be likely to encounter here in Montana. It's available as like a PDF on their website. If anyone's interested in identifying bees and learning more about them, it's a really great tool to get started with. Their website is like Montana Entomology.org. And they have a ton of different publications. They did a whole thing a couple of years ago about surveying the bumblebees in Montana specifically. There's a lot of great, awesome resources on there I would recommend. And then to kind of end on like a nicer note, and John kind of talked about this too, there's a ton of different studies out there that have started looking at like, okay, how do we, like, maybe we do create a strip of native plants next to our crop, or we have these different initiatives, small scale success stories of planting pollinator habitat in urban settings. And they've showed that it does increase diversity of our native pollinators, and it does so rather quickly. So kind of a good note, it's not all doom and gloom. Definitely insects are in decline, but probably because of agricultural things, pesticide exposure, a changing climate, all that kind of stuff. But doing your part in planting native plants can for sure help boost their populations. So with that, here's some of my contact info if anybody has questions. You don't have to ask them right now. I'm always happy to take a call or whatever. So thanks. Answered questions during it.
Bees sting you?
They can. All female bees can sting you. Male bees don't have stingers, so they will never sting you. And they're probably really unlikely to bite you. But all females, basically it's called a modified ovipositor, where they like branched off from their ancestral folks long ago. When they were like boring into wood and that kind of stuff, they basically like split, and now a stinger is used just as a defensive mechanism, and they have a whole nother structure that deposits eggs. So it's kind of related to that structure in them.
Are you seeing any small hive beetles in Montana?
Every now and then, because we get commercial dealers coming up from Texas, but they're a pretty southern pest. They're regulated, like I do usually eradicate stuff when I see it, or tell them to get out of the state really quickly and go back to where they came, but
You have to destroy the hive.
yeah, usually. Or just the equipment, like I'll tell them that they can shake the bees into, if they have some like new equipment, they can do that, but usually we try to destroy the frames in particular. 'Cause that's where they lay a lot of their eggs.
How long have you been working in this position?
6 years.
I always wonder what you think about the idea of having less lawns.
I'm a huge proponent of having less lawns. If it were up to me, I would be walking around with that seed mix and just throwing it all over everyone's green grass, but that probably wouldn't be. Maybe that could be like a fun superhero or something. Yeah. They just don't provide any shelter for our native insects. They don't do a whole lot for the soil. Someone was asking about the depth of plant roots, and the stuff we put in our lawns has roots like this deep, and there's a ton of different studies out there that have people have done a crosscut of native plants in a prairie, and it's like those roots go down dozens to hundreds of feet. So they just.
Do you have ideas for if a person should end up at a house with a intense sod lawn, how a person deals with that? Other than back-breaking digging, which is.
Yeah, I would
getting
say
beyond.
start small, think of, because I do think that, it's good to have like a walkway. I don't think that we should just live in a tall grass prairie. That'd be cool, but not necessarily very practical. So you can just kind of start small, and when you're, if you just have a square area, for example, like maybe cut in a couple of corners and plant some stuff, and then as time grows on, you can move all that kind of closer to the center, and then shape your walkway or whatever based on that. But for sure, I'm from Ohio originally, and before I moved out here to go to grad school and then got this job, I worked for a native plant nursery, and we did a lot of rain garden, whatever garden restorations stuff. And I think a lot of people were like really gung ho about the native plant thing, and they're like, did their whole front yard, and maybe they thought it was great, but their neighbor hated it, or they were like, this is so much work. It's like, well, we don't want to deter anybody from that. So yeah, I would just say start small and work your way inward for sure.
Do you think they got the majority of those murder bees?
I think they did.
Did they?
The proper term is northern giant hornet. I'm not sure how they really got the whole murder hornet name, other than their sting is really painful, and I definitely wouldn't want a hummingbird size wasp flying at me by any means. But from the last I heard, they were like pretty good about finding a lot of the nests, and they were actually tagging the hornet. They have a really similar life cycle to the leaf cutting bee or to any sort of hornet, where it's, there's just a queen, and then she kind of builds up her nest, and then the queen will overwinter by herself. And I think they did a pretty good job of tagging a lot of workers a couple of years ago and followed them back to their nests and then eradicated the nests, and have done pretty good monitoring and haven't been able to find any others, or at least haven't gotten any reports of it. So
I apologize for calling them murder.
that's okay. You're fine. I'm just giving you a hard time. Yeah. Okay, cool. There's some, I think some of you were maybe at our weed talk yesterday or the day before, but there's some weed ID books up there if you didn't grab one and were dying to grab one, as well as some kind of ID books too, if anyone's interested in flipping through them.
Did you get the Michelle Flanagan's speech last night?
I didn't. I was really sad. She was one of my advisors when I was in grad school. So, were you there?
Yeah.
Was it well attended?
Standing room.
Awesome. That's great. That's really good to hear.
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
full up and chairs right in the back.
Sweet. Cool. Yeah, that's awesome.